Imagine an entire Roman legion that told the emperor, no. That is the sharp, unsettling image at the center of this story, framed by the title you just read, the legion that refused to massacre Christians. It is a story of discipline turned inward, of soldiers trained to obey who instead chose conscience over command. And over centuries, it became one of the most powerful martyr legends of the late Roman world. To understand how extraordinary such a refusal would be, we need a little background. The late 3rd century was an era of crisis and transformation for the Roman Empire. Emperors rose and fell in quick succession. External threats pressed at the frontiers, while internal politics demanded ever more visible loyalty to the person of the emperor. Diocletian and his colleague Maximian established the tetrarchy, a system meant to stabilize rule. And with it came an emphasis on imperial authority and public rituals that bound subjects to Rome's political order. Military obedience was absolute. An army was expected to carry out orders without hesitation, including public acts of loyalty that had religious overtones. In that climate, refusal was not only insubordination, it was treason. Into this tense world marches a body of men known in the sources as the Theban Legion, Legio Thebana. According to tradition, they were recruited from Thebes in Upper Egypt, Christians serving in the Roman army under officers such as Maurice, often called Mauritius, Exuperius, and Candidus. They are said to have been sent to the western provinces to help suppress unrest and to bolster imperial power in Gaul. Their route, in the telling, takes them across the Alps to a narrow, dramatic valley at Agaunum, the place later called Saint Maurice in what is now Switzerland. What happens next is the heart of the legend. Imperial authorities, in some versions represented by Maximian himself, demanded that soldiers participate in pagan sacrifices or join in the suppression of local rebels who were believed to be Christian or sympathetic to Christianity. Faced with an order that would force them to renounce their faith or to slaughter innocent people, the Theban Legion reportedly refused. The moral conflict is immediate and stark. Obey the emperor and violate their conscience, or obey their faith and risk incurring the worst penalties Rome could hand down upon soldiers. The account preserved in Christian tradition is dramatic. It tells of an initial refusal, followed by escalating punishments intended to break the legion's resolve. Central to these punishments is the practice of decimation, a form of military discipline that, in Rome, meant selecting 1 in every 10 men of a unit to be executed by their comrades as a collective penalty. Used rarely and reserved for extreme cases, decimation was designed to terrify and to enforce unity through fear. In the story of the Theban Legion, decimation is applied not once, but repeatedly. Each round removes more men from the formation, yet the survivors, bound by faith and solidarity, remain steadfast. Hagiographers later amplified the tale. They describe successive decimations, hundreds put to death, and ultimately the extermination of the entire unit in the valley of Agaunum. Tradition even supplies a striking number, often repeated in medieval and later accounts, that the legion numbered some 6,600 men. That figure should be approached with caution. It belongs to the world of hagiographic memory and devotional literature rather than the kind of precise muster rolls historians prefer. Scholars point out that such numbers are likely symbolic or inflated. What is more important than the arithmetic is the moral image. Disciplined soldiers, trained to obey above all, choosing martyrdom over complicity. The valley of Agaunum then becomes a locus of commemoration. According to the tradition recorded by later writers, the bodies of the martyrs were venerated, and a shrine grew where they had fallen. Over time, the memory of the Theban Legion fed the cult of Saint Maurice and his companions. Monasteries and churches were dedicated at the site. Through liturgy, relics, and pilgrimage, the story traveled across Christendom, serving as a potent example of military piety and moral resistance. For communities living under different regimes or facing their own pressures to conform, the legend offered a model. Fidelity to God could trump obedience to the state. A few broader historical frames make that legacy even more striking. Within a generation or two of the events attributed to the Theban Legion, imperial attitudes toward Christianity shifted. Diocletian's reign culminated in severe persecutions around the turn of the 4th century, but by 313 AD, Constantine and Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, granting Christians legal toleration. Whether the memory of martyrdom such as Agaunum influenced policy is not something sources can directly prove, but the story certainly participated in a larger cultural movement that transformed Christianity from a persecuted sect into a religion with public standing. At this point, it is essential to step back and address how historians read the evidence. The principal written witness for the Theban Legion's fate comes from Eucharius of Lyon, a 5th century bishop who wrote accounts of the martyrs of his region. Eucharius's work preserves the memory of Agaunum, but he wrote more than a century after 286 AD, the date usually attached to the alleged executions. That gap matters. Hagiography, the literature of saints' lives and martyrdoms, had its own aims: to edify, to inspire devotion, to strengthen community identity. Over time, stories gather details, symbolic numbers, and moral emphasis that serve those aims more than they serve precise chronology. When historians examine the Theban Legion narrative, they raise a number of reasonable doubts without denying the story's power. Some suggest that the tale may conflate multiple martyrdoms, or that a smaller unit, perhaps a detachment rather than an entire legion, suffered for refusing orders. Others point out the absence of contemporary military records or imperial correspondence corroborating such a large-scale execution. The repeated decimations described in the legend, while rooted in a real Roman punishment, may have been adapted as a dramatic device to show increasing moral pressure and the legion's sustained refusal. In short, the broad outlines, soldiers punished for refusing to abandon their faith, may well reflect real tensions between Roman authority and Christian conviction. The scale, sequence, and some particulars are precisely the parts scholars treat as open to question. That historiographical caution should not be mistaken for dismissal. The life of a tradition is not measured only by archival corroboration. The story of the Theban Legion was, for centuries, a living memory embedded in liturgy, place, and art. It helped define ideals of Christian witness among soldiers and civilians alike. It gave the people of a remote alpine valley a sacred history that connected them to the larger church. It offered a narrative in which conscience, even within the most disciplined institution of the ancient world, could assert itself against imperial command. Consider for a moment the human texture of that image. Banners snapping in a cold alpine wind, ranks of veterans trained to follow orders, an officer forced to weigh military law against the visible distress of men who cannot in good conscience comply. Even if the precise words and actions recorded by later writers are not verbatim history, the scenario speaks to enduring ethical questions. What does loyalty mean when orders demand violence against the innocent? What does courage look like when it is refusal rather than attack? The story of Agaunum crystallizes a dilemma that recurs whenever institutions place obedience above conscience. Sometimes the bravest act is to say no. Early Christian communities seized upon such episodes because they provided moral exemplars, models for how to live and die. Martyr narratives offered more than moral instruction. They fostered communal identity. Relics and shrines cited these stories in geography, allowing pilgrimage and ritual to anchor belief. The cult of St. Maurice and his companions at Agaunum is a prime example of how a local memory can amplify into a trans-regional devotion, shaping art, liturgy, and even political claims over centuries. For viewers today, there is another layer of interest: how modern historians and believers negotiate the gap between devotion and verifiable history. It is possible to honor the spiritual force of a tradition while also acknowledging the limitations of the sources. Eucherius of Lyon provides a window into 5th century memory, not a contemporary eyewitness report. Archaeology and military records do not decisively confirm the mass execution narrative. Scholars differ, and reasonable reconstructions range from a kernel of martyrdom expanded into a full-scale legend to the possibility that multiple martyrdoms were woven into a single compelling narrative. That ambiguity is itself instructive. Sometimes the truth of a story for a community is inseparable from the role it plays in their identity. So what should we take away from the legion that refused to massacre Christians? First, that the story, whether entirely factual in every detail or not, captures something historically real about the tensions between Roman authority and Christian conscience in a fraught era. Second, that martyr legends functioned as more than records. They were instruments of memory that could inspire, unify, and challenge. Third, that a sober reading requires both respect for devotional significance and critical attention to sources. If this kind of late Roman history interests you, a good place to deepen the background is Mary Beard's SPQR, which offers a rich portrait of Roman society and power. And if you enjoy these deep dives into church history and the dramatic dilemmas it contains, consider subscribing. There is more to explore. Before we close, reflect for a moment on the moral question at the heart of this tradition. When duty collides with conscience, what should prevail? Is it possible to imagine a modern parallel in which an entire institution refuses an order it deems immoral? Whether or not every detail of a Gaudium is historically exact, the image lingers because it forces that question into view. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you find the Theban Legion story credible as recorded, or do you see it primarily as a powerful symbolic tradition? And if you found this account thought-provoking, subscribe for more historical explorations and watch our next video on martyrdom and memory in late antiquity.